Wasabi, everybody, and welcome to a very exciting lesson. Today we're going to be talking about Angular 2. This is a crash course that I actually gave just last night. We're in March 2017. I think you're going to really enjoy it, and I'm going to make it as concise as possible. So let's get rocking, let's get rolling. Here we go. What do you need to install in order to set up this project? First of all, you'll notice that in the description I put in a couple of links. I put in a link to the GitHub repo with something called a Spotify app by Douglas Traversy. Douglas Traversy made this Spotify app. He built it using Angular 2. These are the prerequisites for building with Angular 2 and specifically for the Spotify app. First of all, you're going to need Git and you're going to need Node.js installed on your computer. Node.js for every single Angular 2 project. That's what Angular 2 is built upon for server-side. Ola is actually a VPN. It allows me to pretend that I'm browsing the internet from the United States. That way I can listen to Spotify music, which is a big feature of the app that we're going to run through together today. Traversy has a 7-video series about it, but I really enjoyed his video, but I felt like there were some fundamentals that were still missing, and I brought my own spice, my own flavor, and a couple of other sources that I think you're really gonna appreciate. Let's rock on. Let's keep on moving forward. Tonight's agenda is to spark your curiosity by exposing you to the fundamentals of Angular 2 and sharing with you some fantastic NG2 apps with even better tutorials. So my philosophy in terms of learning is that when you are passionate about a project, or when you find some projects that you're really passionate about, that's going to keep you motivated. It's going to be your engine to keep on moving forward, keep on studying, and spending more time with the code. And I think that that's the most important. For some reason this link doesn't work, don't worry about it. Just click the link in the YouTube description, and that'll take you straight to the GitHub repo. Make sure to clone the repo, follow the instructions in the README file. It's just like any Angular app or React app. Just go in there, just npm install it all, and you're gonna be good to go. Alright, so the table of contents. So, of course, anybody who's just embarking upon this journey of studying Angular 2, everybody's going to have their own ideas of what the most important things to study are. But over the course of 2 weeks of research, I realized that these were the most important elements for me. It was going to be demystifying components. This is what we're going to cover in today's lesson too. We have the Spotify API because that's part of Traversy's GitHub repo. We have Douglas Crockford and Old School JS. We're going to talk about why we need to go back to our roots in order to understand Angular 2 components. Then we're going to touch upon briefly NG2 HTML syntax. That's probably the simplest part of the lesson. Just really simple. How do you put in inject your HTML with some really cool Angular 2 features. Then we're going to talk about RxJS observables and streams. RxJS is a library that's endorsed by Google, the Google team of Angular 2. And that's why it's really important to spend a couple of pages running through what the heck it is, what's observables, what streams. We're going to talk about it. I'm even going to give you some code to play around with. We're also going to play around with some code based on Douglas Crockford. And that's going to help us understand components. It's going to understand what the heck is happening in the Spotify API. The Spotify app, and it's going to be a really good backbone. It's going to be a really good foundation for understanding Angular 2, no matter what you're reading, no matter what you're working on or cloning. Finally, we're going to have fat arrows of ES6. That's also a part of the latest version of JavaScript is the fat arrows. In case you haven't heard of them yet, haven't used them yet, no worries. We're going to talk about them just very briefly, just one page. And then we're going to talk about what the heck is Redux. Redux actually helps you, helps all your components remain in sync with one another. It makes sure that all the data of the various components is in sync. If one component is updated, it should be updated throughout the entire application. And Redux is pretty much that database of data for your application to make sure that all of the components are in sync with one another And I'll show you a really practical example. It's really quite simple when you look at it from an example that I'm gonna put in the presentation. And finally, in the presentation, and keeping with the philosophy that the more passionate you are, the cooler the projects you're working on, the more motivation you're gonna have. So we have an Auth0 for Angular 2 authentication. A lot of people like to create new accounts allow their users to create new accounts with Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and GitHub. Auth0 is a great way to do that, and they have awesome resources. And I also have a link to another Traversy video on Auth0. Then we have a Twitter app written in Angular 2. It's made by a guy named Jesse Pinho. He's from Groupon, a coder there. And there's some resources there to a video that he made, and he's also got some really good stuff on Redux. Redux also gives you some really good browser Chrome browser extension and Chrome browser tools for your for developer console, and that's going to be really cool as well. I'll link to that in the presentation. Be sure to click the link in the bottom of this YouTube video for the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, which is saved on SlideShare. And that's going to be really good for you. You can follow along with this presentation, this video with that presentation, and that way you'll be able to access all the links. And we're going to go through some code together and so on. Finally, there's a Reddit clone that's written in Angular 2 made by a company called ngbook2. They also wrote an ebook about it. You can get the first 2 chapters utterly free. The first half is about Angular 2 fundamentals, and the second half is specifically about the Reddit project. That's why I put links here for projects that also have awesome tutorials already. So that's going to help you out, hopefully. Kudos to the author. This talk is based on a project by Douglas Traversy called Build an Angular 2 Spotify App. It's a 7-part video series on YouTube. You can click right here in order to view it in the presentation, and I highly recommend that as well. I built on what Traversy was talking about, but I also added in some new things to this crash course. Let's talk about the 10,000 hour rule. Malcolm Gladwell talks about it. I think it's in his book, The Tipping Point. He says, it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert at anything. And that's always been a comforting thought for me, that, you know what, even if you're struggling with a specific subject at the very beginning, it's okay. I love this image of these 2 characters here. They're standing on a mountaintop. They're just looking at the journey ahead of them, but they're savoring every moment along the way. So let's begin this journey together, shall we? Let's talk for a second about text editor. If you don't have a good code highlighting with your text editor, you can download either Visual Studio Code by Microsoft or Atom for Angular 2 color highlighting. Make sure to check out one of those code editors as you begin your first steps on this journey. A word of warning: if you're scavenging through the internet for Angular 2 sources over the course of your learning, be sure to check the source. Be sure to check the date, because a lot of times some of the resources are going to be out of date. For example, here's a quote from a site called 2effingdevelopers.com. It was on the first page of Google results, so they must be relatively good resource. But what they wrote here is, warning: this post is very old and experimental. Angular 2 has changed a lot since March 2015, and nothing here is a valid resource anymore. A little bit over the top, but still very important for you guys to keep in mind that some of the resources may be outdated. Finally, let's talk about Mr. Miyagi and the Karate Kid, because that's really going to set the tone for the presentation as well. I believe the Karate Kid in the movie gets beat up by some guys. Mr. Miyagi comes, does some fancy moves, beats them up, and the Karate Kid comes to him and says, "Hey man, how'd you do that?" Mr. Miyagi says, "I'll teach you, but you're going to have to follow my instructions." And Mr. Miyagi says, "I want you to study methodologically. Wax on, wax off." He has this kid color cars, wax some cars with new paint, and then the kid needs to paint a fence also. And Mr. Miyagi keeps on saying, wax on, wax off. It's the fundamentals, and I think that studying Angular 2 is really similar to that. because you need to study your foundations. You need to study the fundamentals. And that's why we're going to go back to classic JS. Parts of this presentation, you may feel like, you may feel a little bit frustrated or that you're going backwards. Why do I need to go back to classic JS to understand this whole high-tech new framework? But you know what? If you understand the vanilla JavaScript, you're going to be in good shape. So that's good too. So let's look at this resource. Now we're beginning. We're beginning to look at what exactly is Angular 2. And Angular 2 is actually a framework for developing applications for the browser. And it's got some really good stuff. Here's the basic breakdown of it. As you can see, we have something called components. We're going to touch a lot on components over the course of this three-part series. Components are essentially where all of the logic of the application is going to be stored. And for example, in this particular example, we see that we have maybe 3 components, right? This navbar is considered one component, and it's got specific functionality attached to it. This piece on the left side has some functionality to it, and it's got a space of the view attached to it. And finally, this part over here has a space of the view and some functionality attached to it. So for example, in the component, this section over here is going to be called a Typescript file. The logic of the application of every single component is contained within something called a Typescript file. It's then compiled into JavaScript. So everything that you type in JavaScript is understood in TypeScript. So just pretend like it's a normal JS file. Start typing away, do your thing. You should be good. So, for example, if you have a search bar over here, what you'll do is you'll put the features and the functionality, the functions, into this section over here, the component, the TS file, and you'll say these functions are related to this HTML template, and whatever happens within the user experience in this HTML template is also going to go back into the logic of the application, and stuff is going to happen dynamically while the user is on the page. It's going to go around in a circle, wax on, wax off. Meanwhile, stuff is going to get injected into the component before the component is sent off to the browser. We're going to see what gets injected, all sorts of libraries, a service, and other necessary other components that this component might be based off. We have one big module component where everything else is kind of stuffed into, and we'll talk about that. Meanwhile, before we get cracking on Traversy's Spotify app written in Angular 2, we're also going to talk about the Spotify API. And what happens over the course of this app is that the Spotify API is accessed, and it's called by our application. It all begins at the end of the day within the home page, and we can launch this application. You'll see over here that we have, for example, in this particular app, we have, you see, a navbar. Everything JS presents Spotify in Angular 2. That's considered a navbar right there. So that's considered a component right there, and this little section on the bottom is another component. This search bar is considered the search component, this whole section here. And we'll see in the code what that looks like, but the most important thing for you to know is that the moment that somebody types in some text into the bar, it goes back into the logic, and it sends a request to Spotify, and it says, hey Spotify, do you know any bands that begin with the word AC, and Spotify will say, yeah, AC/DC, AC Slater, all these other guys. Then you can click on AC/DC and so on, but it all happens in terms of objects. Objects are sent back from Spotify. So we'll talk a little about that. Let's talk about what the heck components are. Components are the basic building blocks of Angular applications. A component controls a portion of the screen, a view, through its associated template. So in the Spotify app, for example, the one that we looked on in the previous page, we have something like 5 components. We have the About component. We have the album component, artist, navbar, and we also have something called the search component as well. We're going to touch on the search component as well. So in the next step, just to cover the foundations, when you git clone your Spotify app, you're going to open it up in your Visual Studio Code in your text editor. This is what it's going to look like. You have over here all of the component files on the left hand side. And you have your images, you have your service files over here, and you have here something called app.component.ts. Practically speaking, just stuff all your other components in here, and all the necessary libraries, router directives, and so on, and the selector. We're going to talk a little bit about that soon, and so on. Stuff it all into the app.component.ts. Google is moving towards calling this the app.module.ts. It's HQ for your app, essentially. Okay, and now we have something called the album.component.ts. I wanted to show you what the heck an actual TypeScript file looks like. What does a component look like as TypeScript? And it looks really intimidating right now, but that's okay. I just want to show you this particular slide in order to get you to start asking some questions about what you're going to need to research. First of all, you'll notice over here there's a TypeScript file. This .js.map thing, don't worry about a thing. You don't need to understand that. It's totally illegible and unreadable. Every single time that you create a .ts file and your application is running, the TypeScript is going to automatically create this .js.map file. So you don't have to worry about that at all. The only thing that's going to be totally automatic once you create your .ts file over here. And so the most important two elements for you as a developer to understand is the .ts file and the .html file. Like I said, the functionality of every single box of every single component is contained within the TypeScript file, and that TypeScript file is pretty much joined at the hip to the HTML file. We're going to talk a little bit more about how they interact with one another. But imagine to yourself that movie Twins starring Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger. They're two long-lost brothers, and no matter what, they're always going to be in communication with one another. Stuff is sent from the logic to the HTML, and the HTML actually also sends stuff back to the TypeScript file. It's called in Angular, it's called two-way binding, meaning that the data goes both ways. All right. A couple of questions over here. Just I want to raise the questions. What the heck is a class doing here? What's its role in a component? What is the ID and the album? These are called properties. What are these? Why does every component have properties? And why are we using the keyword, the word this over here? What's a constructor also? We're going to say, what is the constructor doing? The Spotify service? What's my service doing within my component? It's a good question, and those are the three main things. So remember, we got classes, properties, we got constructors, and the this keyword. Let's start answering some of those questions. In order to do that, we're going to go right back to the foundation. Douglas Crockford, one of the developers of the JS language, he says the following, and you can feel free to meditate upon this. Click on that link and read it, and do some yoga, light a candle, and think about these lines. Here we go. JavaScript is fundamentally about objects. Arrays are objects, functions are objects are objects. So what are objects? Objects are collections of name-value pairs. The names are strings and the values are strings. Numbers, booleans, and objects, including arrays and functions. If a value is a function, we can consider it a method. When a method of an object is invoked, the this variable is set to the object. The method can then access the instance variables through the this variable, and objects can be produced by constructors, which are functions which initialize objects. So that might be a lot to take in, but it reminds you everything in JavaScript is objects. Every single object has a ton of properties. Sometimes you're going to have some functions within an object, and that's called a method. And finally, we use constructors in order to initialize objects, and that's going to come into play really shortly. Let's have a look at this code pen together, guys. Okay, so we have over here some JS, and we have here some JS. So the question is, one second, let me put it into, I open up a new tab, I press Control-Shift-J, and that's really what I want to play with. Open it in a separate window and we're good. Okay. Fine. Here we go. We have a class called rectangle, and it's already, this is old school JavaScript. This is vanilla. They call it vanilla because when you eat a little bit of ice cream, when you buy ice cream, you're not going to get the fudge and the sprinkles and all the caramel on it. You're just going to start off with some vanilla. And that's exactly what old school JavaScript is about. All these libraries and these fancy frameworks like jQuery, ng1 and 2, they're just the toppings at the end of the day. And that's a really important concept to remember whenever you feel overwhelmed and feel like you just can't move forward and do fancy stuff. Just go back to the fundamentals and it's going to help you out. And this is just plain old vanilla JavaScript, no fancy frameworks. It says class rectangle, constructor with a height and width, this dot height, this dot width. This whole section over here is essentially just a blueprint. We're saying over here that we may want to create some rectangle-like objects in the future, and it's going to have these properties, it's going to have these methods, and this is the prototype for it. So if the moment that we write var square equals new rectangle, something gets created, okay? Something called a square is created. And let's look at exactly what is created over here. Let's look at it together. What's created, we console log the square. And this is exactly what's created. See, we created an object based on this blueprint. We created an object with 1, 2, 3 properties, right? And also, guess what? A couple of methods as well. Calc area as well. And now that we understand that's all part of vanilla JavaScript, it's much, much easier for us to understand the basics of what the heck is a component. And that's what we're going to touch upon now. You can feel free to play around with that pen, but notice that it's almost the exact same thing. Class, this, constructor, and properties. Okay? It's almost the exact same thing that we see. And let's have a look at what it looks like. Okay, so bam. What essentially what we're saying is that this whole top section of the app, this is essentially this is a search component.ts file. Okay, again, it's a TypeScript file. What's happening over here is that we're creating a blueprint for an object. We're creating a blueprint for a component, and we're telling the app anytime that the user asks for a specific for the search bar. I want you to just go back to this and do var square equals a new oh sorry, what was the syntax? Var square equals a new rectangle, right? I want you to create a new instance of this component and create it on the DOM, send it out to the user, and wish him a happy birthday also, right? That's what it's all about. I want to go into the code itself, and that way we'll be able to look at things a little more clearly over here. Let's have a look. Because we have here a quote from the Ionic blog. And the Ionic blog tells us something like this. First of all, have a look over here in our file. Once you've git cloned it, right, you open it up. You see that there's this line over here called navbar here. What the heck is that about? This is an HTML file. It's in our root. Okay, it's in the root of the app folder, and we say this is the part where we tell the HTML fetch us instantiate the navbar component, send it onto the screen. This part over here where we say router outlet, it says go to the app routes.ts file, and in order to understand which component we're supposed to be serving up. So as you can see over here, that the user experience and these components are just waiting eagerly on the sidelines. Imagine you have the football game happening, right? And it's the big game finally happening. And these are the guys that are sitting on the bench right now. And the moment that their number is called, they just have to get out there and start acting for the user experience to make stuff happen. Okay, and that kind of explains to us a little bit, that gives us the backdrop for this slide over here, slide number 17. Just trying to figure out, oh, let's see, oh no, yeah. So Baba, slide number 17, I just want to see, oh good. We're going to end this video after this slide, because this is one of these aha moments. The moment that you understand this concept about what the heck are components, it's gonna pretty much give you smooth sailing. It's not gonna be totally smooth. You're still gonna be frustrated, but it's gonna make it the process of learning Angular 2 a lot easier for you. This is what they wrote on in the Ionic blog. He wrote, we can configure the selector our component will look for to instantiate itself, like my component. Remember we saw that in the HTML? And also set the template. So we set a template for the component, the HTML file, and we also put this my component syntax in the HTML. That way we know when to load a new instance of a component. And it says when our component is instantiated and rendered on the page, we have an instance of our component. We can modify the instance data of that component, call methods on it, and pass it around to other components. It's just an object. And that's the beautiful thing about components. Go back to your roots and you'll understand it all. Meditate upon this point. This is the end of video of Angular 2 Crash Course, video number 1. We're going to be back very shortly for video number 2, so be sure to check that video out as well.